Now recognize Ranking Member Markey for any opening statements he may have.
Yep. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this very important hearing and phenomenal panel which you have put together, and the subject matter that we are going to consider. Cybersecurity has become one of the most critical security, economic, and privacy issues facing our nation, but it's certainly not a new threat. As the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Telecommunications back in 1993, I convened 2 hearings to explore what I called at the time the sinister side of cyberspace. Cybersecurity was then an issue which was of great concern. At those hearings, we saw how an ordinary cellular telephone could be reprogrammed to become a scanner capable of eavesdropping on other people's phone calls by just turning it over and switching a few wires and then listening to the cell phone calls of congressmen in the Rayburn building in 1993. We saw a videotape of how Dutch hackers broke into the Pacific Fleet Command and the Kennedy Space Center from a computer terminal in Amsterdam in 1993. But that was back in the old days. That was before Facebook and WikiLeaks, when only birds tweeted. That was the BF era, the before Facebook era. We're now in an era which is so much more dangerous than that now seemingly prosaic era that I am referring to, as dangerous as it was at that time. Even when it was clear that developing a national policy for cybersecurity was of fundamental importance for the future of our national networks, our competitiveness internationally, and our constituent safety and security at home. So it's not a new issue. Now is the opportunity to develop that national policy. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, because as this committee begins shaping a national privacy law, we must include a robust cybersecurity regime that truly protects the American public, our industries and government institutions from the sinister side of cyberspace. We can and we should give people a privacy bill of rights, providing people the right to tell companies that they cannot share or sell their personal information without consent. But you can't truly have privacy without ensuring your personal information is protected from hackers. And there is no better place to begin exploring what the cybersecurity regime should look like than discussing cybersecurity protections for the Internet of Things, or IoT. Because we know that North Korean, Russian, Chinese hackers want to infiltrate our networks and our own devices, so we need to know how we can stop it. But we also need to know how we stop domestic hackers from compromising the information of Americans as well. Because there's no question that while IoT holds the promise of revolutionizing the way we live and we work, that we should also be wary, because IoT also stands for the Internet of Threats, which operates simultaneously. With as many, as the chairman said, tens of billions of IoT devices, internet-connected thermostats, refrigerators, baby monitors, to name a few, projected to be in our pockets, cars, homes by 2020, cyber vulnerabilities will continue to pose a direct threat to economic prosperity, privacy, and our nation's security. In 2016, for example, hostile actors launched a massive denial of service attack, where hundreds of thousands of hacked IoT devices, cameras, baby monitors, and home routers were commandeered and used to send overwhelming streams of Internet traffic to core parts of the Internet's infrastructure. Ultimately, several major websites were disrupted, including Twitter, Netflix, Spotify, Airbnb, Reddit, Etsy, and the New York Times. Recently, the Washington Post reported on a troubling case where hackers accessed an Internet-connected baby monitor and used the device's speaker to beam pornographic audio into a 3-year-old's bedroom. Cybercriminals were even able to access a casino's high roller database by hacking an Internet-connected thermometer in a fish tank granting them access to the casino's network. There is clearly a Dickensian quality to the internet. And IoT devices, and it's the best of Wi-Fi and the worst of Wi-Fi simultaneously. It can enable, it can ennoble, it can degrade, it can debase. We're here today to find out how we stop the degrading and debasing of this system. And that's why I'm so excited, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to explore these opportunities to enhance our cyber defenses, including discussing my Cyber Shield Act legislation that would create a voluntary cybersecurity certification program for IoT devices. I want to thank the witnesses for testifying and you, Mr. Chairman, for this very important hearing.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Geiger, Mr. Eggers said that when he was shopping and he talked to the salesperson didn't know anything about what the standards of cybersecurity are. And as a result, Mr. Eggers can't know. So if the salesman doesn't know, and the company hasn't told him, and he's out shopping for some device, whatever it might be, that creates a huge black hole into which consumers continually fall and their families become more vulnerable. So have we reached like crisis proportions in terms of the absence of cyber security protections built into these devices across our country, Mr. Geiger?
I'm not sure if we've reached crisis proportions, but
Pick a word.
But it's serious.
Okay, serious.
It's very serious. And on the issue of consumer awareness, we think that is a vital component of comprehensive cybersecurity protections that should apply to IoT as well as other services. When I think about my mother, she's a very smart person, but technology is not her thing. The idea of me telling her to go into her router, into her IoT devices to check for a default password and possibly change the password, check and see whether or not your IoT device encrypts your personal information, these things are just not realistic. What I can tell her is look for a seal, look for a label, and it will be weird if we end up in a situation in the United States where the label I'm telling her to look for comes from the EU Cybersecurity Act, which will have certifications, in particular for IoT. I'd like to see something like that in the United States.
So that sounds a lot like the Cyber Shield Act that I haven't introduced yet this year, but would give that information. It would act like the Energy Star program. So you walk in, you look at the refrigerator, you look at the stove, and then is it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in terms of energy efficiency, right? That's really what you're looking for. How much is this refrigerator going to cost me over the next 15 years? And I'm willing to buy some energy efficiency now because I'll save money in the long run in terms of the refrigeration cost. So then you can make up your own mind on this. So what do you think about that approach, this legislation that I haven't introduced yet, but that kind of would provide that kind of information to consumers?
So we're strong supporters of the approach, and note that there are a number of other programs that have been successful like it in the past. Energy Star is one, the recycling symbol is another, nutrition labels. These things can be effective if there's enough adoption. Failure to adopt across the private sector will just result in failure of the program, sort of like what we saw with the trustee label some years ago. So we are supporters of the approach, and we think that it can make a difference, but it's not the only thing that we think should happen to improve IoT security.
Right, but this legislation would create an advisory committee of cybersecurity experts from academia, industry, consumer advocacy communities, and the public to create cybersecurity benchmarks for IoT devices. And it's a very similar process that many of our witnesses are undergoing and applauding here today. And then IoT manufacturers can voluntarily put up their own 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all voluntary, but then suffer in the marketplace if consumers think that it was misleading.
And we note that it's voluntary and that it's based on industry standards and best practices, and we think that's a good approach.
And then the industry participant has a choice of picking that level of security. Do you think that makes sense, Mr. Bergman?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I was trying to puzzle out the relationship between changing default passwords and a label. I know that this label proposal has been discussed We,
It would be voluntary, and it would be done in conjunction with industry participants. Could you support that?
we're currently supporting an industry effort on baseline security that's working public-private partnerships with NIST. It is parallel tracking what's being done there. It's being mapped to what's being done in Europe. We feel that that's the fastest, most efficient, best way to get to a more secure internet.
Yeah. What do you think, Mr. Mayor?
I think, that-
Under that system, will consumers have 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 stars? Will they have some measure, Mr. Bergman, will that system, the system that you're talking about that you're working on, would Mr. Geiger's mother or Mr. Eggers be able to see it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in terms of?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. Let me say that we're very appreciative of the enthusiasm on solving these problems.
No, I know
And
that. I'm not
consumer
looking, I'm just
education-
looking at what would the consumer see in Best Buy? Do you want them to be able to see that it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, with 1 being the least security? Do you want that for the consumers?
The
Should
best
they
way I
have
can- the best way I
something-
can- the best way I can answer this
If they're gonna
is
fork over
you-
$600, should they be able to know its energy efficiency, the
Yeah,
Energy Star, and should they know what the
Absolutely.
cybersecurity are?
The problem with the comparison with Energy Star, Senator, is that energy is very easily measured, whereas cybersecurity is not. And when we talk about a mark or a label or something like that, using the smart television example, if I go in to buy a smart TV, there's a 4K Ultra HD logo, there's an HDMI, there's a Wi-Fi logo, there's a Bluetooth logo, there's a SD card logo, there's high dynamic range. Consumers have a little bit of logo fatigue. So we find that the best and strongest approach is for the manufacturers, the retailers, to take their burden and
Well, how about this? If the device which the person purchased patches, would the industry then say, we're going to patch the device to the highest standards as soon as it develops? Would that satisfy it?
Could I offer a thought?
Well, I'm just let me finish with Mr. Berg. Would that satisfy you?
absolutely, thank you for the question.
If it could,
So
could patch?
NTIA has done an excellent job on patchability. We're very interested in the results of that because patchability is a significant challenge in terms of actually executing. There's a number of,
If it could be executed, would you support it? If it could be executed,
sorry, could you put a finer box around what we would be supporting? Could you say again?
you'd be supporting a patch standard that protected against the vulnerability that was identified. Would you? And we could do that. Would you support it?
Well, thank you for the question,
And then the
Senator. I
consumer-
would have to.
then the consumer would
I believe
know.
we'd have to review it before we could.
Yeah, I thought so, yeah. So we're trying here, honestly, just to have something that matches the urgency and gives the consumers, Mr. Eggers, the information, or Mr. Geiger's mother, the information they need at point of purchase.
Could I offer-
And then if the technology can be developed, NIST maybe could tell us, that you can patch the vulnerabilities, then that should be pretty easy to measure as to whether or not that in fact is working. And I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I'll
That's
come
all right.
back in another round. I'm
We'll
sorry.
do another round. I'm gonna,
Yeah,
out
thank you.
of courtesy to Senator Blumenthal, I'm gonna turn, Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This goes right to the sinister side of cyberspace. It goes right to the bad part of the whole thing, and we just have to deal with it. And the industry can promise all the wonderful things, and they can deliver that immediately. They can have an algorithm from here to Osaka and back in a quarter of a second. And they can brag about all that transfer of information, but when we ask them about cybersecurity, it's just so complicated, we can't figure it out, we don't know what the algorithm would be, just so complicated to deal with the bad side. So, and I've had this problem before with the Consumer Technology Association when I was trying to pass a law that said that every TV set in America had closed captioning back in 1990. I just had this, oh my goodness, you don't know how complicated that's all going to be. You got to give us more time. Then in 1996, I wanted a V-chip, for violence and sex and language built into every TV set. Oh, it's going to cost $25. It'll get so complicated. Regular consumers won't want it. Then in 2010, on whether or not every wireless device is accessible to the deaf and blind in America. You don't know how complicated it is. You just got to give us all this extra time. So I've done this over and over again, and ultimately each time you have to pass a piece of legislation. Just say, go get it done. Figure it out. You want to argue over 2 years or 3 years to get it done? You want to argue over 6 months or 2 years? Argue over that, but don't argue over whether or not it can get done. Because I've learned too many times just dealing with the Consumer Technology Association. That's always, it's never today and it's not soon. So here's my fear. My fear, and let me ask you this, Mr. Guy, thank you for Rapid 7, being here. Thank you for what you're doing. If your mother's buying an HD TV set today, and she's bringing it right into the living room, can that set potentially be hacked and people are listening to her or even watching her in the living room?
Yes, it can.
Now, how would she know that? Would the salesperson tell her that? Be careful that that TV set can be turned into an actual camera watching you, or that they can listen to you? Would she know that if she was out shopping today?
Most salespeople are very knowledgeable, but my experience with them has been that they have not been able to tell me similar information when I have asked for products that I buy, even high-end products like an HD TV. There are certain things that the user can do to protect themselves, like, for example, you should immediately update your television software and so forth.
Would your mother know how to do that?
She would probably call me and I would talk her through it.
No, I don't mean you. The son she's so proud about that has such great tech skills. I mean an ordinary family. Would they know how to do that?
I can't speak for other families, but it's
I can.
It's a process, and it's something
I will say that that's a very daunting challenge for most families. And I know it's a daunting challenge for history and English majors in college. Very daunting for us. We just look at it and maybe, I'll wait until the TV is 10 years old, right? So would the same thing be possible for a microwave? That could also be turned into, if you can talk to the microwave, could the microwave also be hacked by someone so they can be listening to your conversations in the living room?
At this point, every device ships with some vulnerabilities. There is never going to be we're never going to reach a situation where there's complete security. I think that what is most important now is that we look at preventing the most basic and unreasonable lack of security that we see in some devices.
So you agree, though, that that TV set or that microwave should have a 5-star 4, 3, 2, 1 warning in terms of the protection that's been built into that set against being hacked?
I think that would be one very important component. I think that another, as I've mentioned, is having both agencies establish an IoT baseline within their own areas of authority and having security legislation that protects consumers. This would shift, because part of the problem with the label is that we also don't want to have to put the entire obligation on consumers. It can't just be about consumer awareness. There have to be things that are built into the product as it leaves.
That's what I'm saying, that they would be built in. Now, for instance, when I buy a car, if I bought a car 5 years ago, and it says 5-star safety, 4, 3, 2, 1, I know that 2 years later, it's not the same standard as it was 2 years ago, but I knew when I bought it that it had the highest possible security standard. And if I bought a car that only had a 1 rating, I would know that. And it would probably be even less safe now, but I would know all that. And I would internalize it, and I would make a decision as a customer. And then what happened, of course, is once we set up that system, auto industry competed on safety. They want the
Exactly.
5-star, with consumers smart enough to know that 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, it might have advanced, but at least you did your best for your family, your children, your loved ones in the car at the time. So the same thing is true here, except you can actually, in a digital era, patch remotely and bring it up to standard, huh, Mr. Geiger?
And we think it's critical to have a differentiator for consumer technology that is not just about cost, but that is also about security. Retailers have adapted to things like Energy Star. If you go on Amazon and you try to buy an appliance now, you can filter the search results by Energy Star. I personally, as a consumer that cares deeply about cybersecurity, would filter it by an Energy Shield or a Cyber Shield or other such differentiator. Currently, that does not exist. That is widespread in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so my view, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to, go ahead.
I would just conclude by saying, from my perspective, the least that we should be able to do for families is to give them the safety information they need. And if they want to shortchange their family because the extra money hasn't been spent by the company on building in the cybersecurity or the security into an automobile
Could I?
or an SUV to protect them, then that's a family decision. But at least, the least that we should be able to say is that we tried. We really tried to get this information to families across this country, that their security is at risk. And that's why I think we just have to build a mandate into this legislation and give them a deadline to come up with a consensus. Otherwise, I just think it's an open-ended, take-home exam that will never be finished, and that's what I've found in the past with the industry.
I'm going to.
Okay, I'm sure.
No, I want to wrap, and I want to give